This is Residence 104.4 FM. Flipping marvelous, of course. How you doing? Sat Sri Akal, Naramushka, Salam Alaikum, Ambinia. All right, bub. It's Nick Hennegan with another slice of Literary London. And I'm very pleased to welcome back almost a regular guest now, I think we can say, the Irish poet living in London, of course, Cahal Dallat. Hi again. Nice to see
Hi,
you.
hi, Nick. Great to see you. And yes, it is kind of regular because we keep having these events and needing to talk about them to the wider literary London. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a glorious reason, and there is such a lot going on around. I mean, all of London, certainly West London. So just tell us about the specifics, because as you know, people listen to this podcast. Oh, and I should say as well, if I haven't mentioned it yet, we're in Vision. Oh, you could see us. You could see Cahal's beautiful flute. Yes, I'll leave that one with you. Or if you're listening in stereo, of course, because we are on bohemianbritain.com. The video is. We're also on YouTube. And if you want to join in, I might as well mention it now. Of course, if there's anything on your mind, anything you're planning, then do get in touch. Either radio@mavericktheatre.co.uk, radio@mavericktheatre.co.uk, or I've got my own new address, which is Nick, Nick, at bohemianbritain.com. Ooh. Nick at bohemianbritain.com. But we're going to be talking about, well, it's an important festival, really, for a large chunk, a unique chunk of West London, isn't it, Cahal?
Yes. I mean, well, I'll give you the title first. It's called I Dreamt I Dwelt. Irish composers, W.B. Yeats and Bedford Park's heyday. So you've got three things compressed into that. I Dreamt I Dwelt, lots of people will know, is a great line from I Dreamt I Dwelt in Marble Halls, which is a line that James Joyce seemed to obsess about all his life because Balfe's operas kind of took Irish music internationally. Balfe was married to a singer from Budapest, and he wrote this opera about Bratislava, of all places, and The Bohemian Girl was a massive success. So not only Britain, but all of Europe was awash with music. Just to come back to the basics, I Dreamt I Dwelt. Irish composers, W.B. Yeats and Bedford Park. It's on Wednesday, the 22nd of October at 7:30 p.m. in our favourite Bedford Park venue, which is St. Michael and All Angels, the wonderful arts and crafts church that's kind of been part of the community and cultural and social centre of Bedford Park since its heyday, which is really what we're talking about. And Bedford Park is celebrating its 150th anniversary. It was founded as a unique garden suburb by a Dublin born property developer. I always tell the story. He was a Dublin born property developer. He expanded till he had 400 houses and then he went bust. And I'm sure he's not the first Dublin born property developer to do that. But Bedford Park, therefore, remained this beautifully contained urban village. And because Jonathan Carr, the property developer, his brother happened to run the Grosvenor Gallery, which was exhibiting all the pre-Raphaelite painters. His brother was also a poet and a dramatist. And so they brought in as residents, lots of ordinary people, of course, but also a lot of artists, writers, and so on. The most famous of whom were the Yeats family. And the Yeats family, John Butler Yeats was one might even say he was a failed portrait painter, but he was somebody who had the courage to drop out of being a lawyer and come to London and try and make his living as a portrait painter. And he brought up this absolutely unique family. His two daughters, Lily and Lolly, founded the Irish 20th century craft industry. So when you see Celtic crafts anywhere, whether it's in Glastonbury or Scotland or whatever, the Yeats sisters kind of made all that happen. Jack B. Yeats became Ireland's greatest and most expensive 20th century painter, and Willie won the Nobel Prize. So that was a kind of a centre of Bedford Park, and that's what got me started with the W.B. Yeats artwork project, which is partly why W.B. Yeats is in the title, but it goes much wider than that.
And of course, just for those that don't know, Bedford Park is kind of West London, isn't it? I suppose Chiswick.
It's
Um,
it's 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 on the boundaries between Chiswick and Ealing. Interestingly, the Yeatses lived in a house that is now in the London Borough of Hounslow, in the Chiswick part of the London Borough of Hounslow, and they then ran out of money, as migrants often do, and sent the kids back to stay with Granny. And John Butler Yeats went back to Dublin and hung out with a few friends trying to do some portrait painting there. Then they all came back to Bedford Park, and that's when Yeats had his real flourishing as a young journalist, as a poet, as a dramatist, and partly because of all the lovely people, artists and poets and illustrators and actors who lived around him. So on that second time, when he's a young man now, he's living in Blenheim Road, which is actually now on the Ealing side of the borough. So to give you a sense of how Bedford Park's now celebrating 150 years since this suburb was founded. So he's the event that we're having is, and the stuff we've done all along, is the W.B. Yeats Bedford Park project has been supported by Ealing and Hounslow boroughs. So we've got the Ealing Mayor, the Hounslow Mayor, the Ealing Council Leader, Hounslow Council Leader, Ealing MPs, Chiswick MPs, Deputy Lieutenant, all sorts of people coming along to celebrate Bedford Park's 150th birthday as the world's first ever garden suburb. And the reason it was unique, certainly for a property developer, was it wasn't done for profit. It was
Yeah.
done to create communal happiness, to change the structure of society. People now talk about 15-minute cities. Bedford Park was built as a 9-minute city. Within that little village, there was a church, a club, sports facilities, a school, an art college, a pub, of course, a stores block, because the idea was that nobody would ever have to go into town except to be actors and playwrights and all those things. They would get all their stuff from the local stores. So it was built as a first self-contained community, as a green and pleasant place in the middle of smoky Dickensian London. So you can see why actors, artists, anybody who had business in the West End wanted to come out to Chiswick at night, which was well out in the country then. It was way upriver, up the Thames, a long way from Hammersmith. And so now it's just popping out on the Turnham Green line, on the Turnham Green tube station. But it was the sense of escape. And that same sense of escape that made Victorians love this green and pleasant place that was a throwback to an earlier villagey time is what made them love Irish music. It helped that there were half a dozen key Irish people, writers, composers, arrangers, etc., living in Bedford Park at the time. But of course, Irish music was all over London, ever since Moore's Melodies. And one of the ironies about that, and we'll talk about that on the night, is that Mayfair drawing rooms were filled with the sound of Thomas Moore's songs. The Last Rose of Summer, of course, which was copied by every composer, Berlioz and Mendelssohn and so on, but also The Minstrel Boy, which was about his friends who died in the 98 Rising. So all these English people are sitting around in their ball gowns listening to songs about Irish rebels. And that tension has always been there because Ireland was kind of the dramatic other where these things happened and could be allowed to happen. So by the time Yeats comes along in the late 19th century, there is already Thomas Moore, John Field, an amazing character who invented the nocturne. Chopin, of course, made the nocturnes famous, but John Field traveled all over Europe and is buried in Moscow. So, I mean, that and his fame, he crops up in novels by Tolstoy because he's so famous in Russia. So John Field invented the nocturne. Balfe invented Bohemian opera. Wallace wrote a number of operas which were very popular in London. And then towards the end of the century, you get this ferment of Charles Villiers Stanford comes along to the Royal College of Music. He's a founding professor there. His first intake involves Charles Wood from Armagh. So Stanford's from Dublin, Charles Wood is from Armagh. And these two guys go on to teach, and you won't believe the list of people people like Martin Shaw, John Ireland, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Rebecca Clark, Herbert Hughes, who set the Sally Gardens to music, Gustav Holst, Imogen Holst, Eugene Goossens, and in fact we've got people coming along. Eugene Goossens' great grandnephew and Martin Shaw's granddaughter and one of Yeats's cousins all coming to this event because it's such a coming together of that. So what Stanford really did, brought in Irish airs, contemporary poetry, and trained a generation to look not at Irish airs, but at traditional airs in England. So Ralph Vaughan Williams goes out with a well, it wasn't a tape recorder then, gramophone and recording by hand and recording English folk songs. And Ralph Vaughan Williams' whole oeuvre comes out of that. And so English music, and I'm talking both about folk music here because these people were genuine folk collectors. Yes, they arranged everything orchestrally or for piano or for the concert hall, but they're also the basis of, John Todhunter, who lived just round the corner from me here and round the corner from Yeats. So Yeats was popping in and out all the time. John Todhunter wrote an opera with Charles Wood. So that sounds very highbrow. if I tell you the opera is called Pat in Fairyland, you'll realize it's not quite as highbrow, let's say, as Verdi. But he translated Italian, he translated Heine and Goethe from German, he wrote settings of Heine and Goethe, but he also founded the English Folk Song Society. So here's a man who is deeply embedded in Irish music and Irish culture, writing Irish plays. But he founds the English Folk Song Society along with Kate Lee, who's a very well-known name. She used to pop round to John Todd Hunter's on a Sunday evening for a little sing around, like it was an Irish family home, you know. And that's where the English Folk Song Society comes from. And involved in the English Folk Song Society are composers like Charles Villiers Stanford and Charles Wood. So it's a really magical time. I mean, I suppose at that point I should explain. It's not a talk. It's far from that. Although there's a little bit of talk at the beginning, and there'll be
Yeah,
some
I was going to say,
programming.
how are you going to bring all this
Yeah.
incredible
Well,
legacy into one event?
well, I mean, I've been doing this story, if you like, of Irish music and its intersections with Irish literature around James Joyce, around Yeats, around 1916, around the whole business of Irish politics as well. And I've taken that, I've done it with my wife, the poet Anne Marie Fife, and we've done a words and music performance, which we've taken, done here and in Ireland and all across the US. But what has happened since we started the Yates Bedford Park project, and I know you were there on the day we unveiled that dazzling gyre, that Yeatsian spiral called In Wrought Light by Conrad Shawcross. So that was kind of our first aim, was to create an artwork in Bedford Park that would say to people, Yeats was here, and this spiral going up is Yeats's genius, is the spirit of Bedford Park spinning out into the world. So in doing that, we also created a smartphone tour so you can come along to Turnham Green, cross the road to the church, and out in front of the church on the path that Yeats walked when he used to talk about, as I stand on the roadway and the pavement grey. That's the roadway there, the pavement grey there, and in between is this beautiful artwork. If you go up to the artwork and beside it, there's a QR code which will take you around 10 of Yeats's favourite places, the club in which his plays were first performed, the art school that his brothers and sisters went to, the two homes that they lived in, John Todhunter's home. I talk a lot about John Todhunter. Florence Farr, the actor, lived next to him there. And so and Kieran Hines does the voiceover on that. So that's a fantastic experience. So we did all that. And when we were doing that celebration, it was being officially unveiled by Rowan Williams. I mean, you couldn't unveil it, it's so tall, but Rowan made the point that it was, as he said, definitely there. So he if you like, opened it. And so that evening, with the Irish ambassador there and all sorts of dignitaries and so on, and we had readings by Jeremy Irons, Sinead Cusack, Kieran Hines, and Ruth Nega. And we had music from a group called Irish Heritage, or an organization called Irish Heritage. And so I started going to a lot of their events and got talking to them. And we have this shared interest in promoting Irish culture in London. And while I've been going on in Bedford Park about Yeats and the literary culture, elsewhere I've been going on about Stanford and Wood and Moore and so on. And so we put this idea together for Bedford Park's 150th birthday. Bedford Park Society have put together an exhibition which will also be on display on Wednesday, 22nd of October at St Michael's Church. And the exhibition shows how Bedford Park was ahead of the world in everything, in terms of change of social conventions, in terms of being feminist. Women at the Bedford Park Club joined the Bedford Park Club on the same basis as men. Quite a unique thing in London. On the basis of interior design, became much more simplified rather than the heavy Victorian design and so on. So this is the musical side of that story that says, really, Bedford Park was ahead of the world in everything. I mean, the 60s, where you think, oh, was the great folk revival. The folk revival started here between 1890 and 1900 with people like John Todhunter. So that's kind of where I got involved with Irish Heritage, told the story to them, worked through with a number of people, in particular the artistic director, and we came up with this program that tells that story. So it's practically all music, except that with each of the pieces they go to do, when it comes to Tom Moore, I can explain where his two pieces fit into the story. When it comes to Wood, I can explain how he connected with Todhunter, with Yeats, with Alfred Percival Graves, who's the father of the poet Robert Graves, who was very involved here. And it's very much a musical evening rather than a lecture, which is the kind of thing that I've done
Mm.
purely about music.
Yes, you can tap your toes as well. Brilliant.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is Residence 104.4 FM. We're also on bohemianbritain.com. I'm Nick Hennegan, talking to Cahal Dallat, the Irish poet. I can describe as an Irish poet, and cultural vulture. I'd say that. I
Cultural
must
vulture, that's
throw that
fine.
in
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, about this event. And again, we'll give more details about where you can get tickets and where you can get them from. If you're listening on Residence FM, then of course it's next Wednesday. If you're listening or watching us in vision on bohemianbritain.com, you may have missed it, but there's still a lot going on, and we'll give you some more details about how you can find out more about Bedford Park. I mean, culturally, it's quite an interesting. I mean, being from Birmingham, Britain's second city, and my folks being, of course, from Ireland, from Mayo as well. I was always kind of, it's kind of weird actually. I think you might understand this, but I felt more Irish. They do say if you're in Birmingham, throw a brick and you'll hit a paddy. I felt kind of more Irish when I came to London because I suppose you've got that sort of such a mix of cultures and people here. I mean, we do in Birmingham as well, but I felt it more in London. Is that because I suppose, or is it? Well, you've thought about this obviously. Is it because you've got the great artistic centres of the world, London and Paris and perhaps New York, that attracted people? And I also was reasonably surprised to find out a few years ago that after London, Dublin, pre state, was the sort of the second city of the empire, the British Empire. Has that had any effect, do you think?
Well, I mean, part of the story that I tell around Yeats is that all this celebration of Yeats is, in a sense, a celebration of how a migrant family coming to a capital city, and they were relatively impoverished. They weren't poor by any standards. They weren't as poor as many of the bricklayers and cab drivers who came to London, but they were much poorer than they were in Sligo, where their family had been very minor landowners or vicars and things like that. So they kind of and because John Butler Yeats had given up the law to be a painter, I mean, one particular portrait he did for somebody, and he was paid. His payment took the form of an old bicycle, so he was really scratching around to make a living. Um, but the key thing about London was that for all the people who come into it, it has the infrastructure, it has the networks, it has the theatres. So whether you're Irish or Asian or West Indian, or when you come here, if there's a voice there who wants to write about the Irish or Asian or West Indian experience, there's a theatre there. You might have to bang the door to get in. It might not be easy. And Yeats actually talks about at his school being beaten up because he was Irish, but it didn't stop him going on and getting in touch with theatre people and eventually becoming one of the most significant figures in English literature. And his brother became a painter, etc. So it's really, I mean, I think what London has, it has the theatres, it has the publishers, it has the influencers, it has the critics, like myself, people who in those days were published in the papers, and we tended to talk about things on radio and TV and so on, reviewing the books every week. But of course, Yeats was busy. He had made friends with William Morris, who was very influential, both as a socialist and arts and crafts person and a poet. So when he had his new book, he popped round to William Morris's and gave him a copy, and hoped he would review that in Commonweal. And that's the kind of thing that I would say was happening in London and wasn't happening so much in Birmingham or Glasgow,
Yeah.
So yeah, people keep, and I think even with people, Australians and New Zealanders, I can remember somebody, Janet Frame, I think, talked about it was great being published in New Zealand, but you weren't anybody till you were published in London. Now we would think, oh, it's fantastic, if you got a book published in New Zealand, you're international. But from their perspective, there was still the centre, and so there was this idea. And I think that the other thing that has happened a lot is that we've made a lot of noise, justifiably. Irish institutions in London have been about all the people who came here and built the roads, the nurses, the school teachers, all those good people at that level, and not made enough noise to say, I mean, when I started reviewing theatre here in the 1980s and 90s, I was reviewing at least one play a month for the TLS because there were constant plays by Irish playwrights from Brian Friel and Sean O'Casey, Marina Carr, Sebastian Barry, Martin McDonagh, Conor McPherson. Those people are still going on, and there's practically always some Irish theatre going on in London, and that's long after the Free State and the separation and so on. So if you go back to that 1890s time, the writers, of course, the writers the people that we talk of as English writers, and this is fascinating, really, are Jonathan Swift, Sheridan, Goldsmith, Farquhar, Congreve, Boucicault, right up to Yeats and Shaw and Wilde and Terence Rattigan and Iris Murdoch. And every one of them's Irish, even though everybody says they're English literature. And the same thing happens with music. So that people, I mean, I can show you a dozen websites that say the English composer Charles Villiers Stanford, he was Irish. The English composer Charles Wood. So that sense, and because they weren't writing Irish songs, they were writing Anglican hymns, they were writing concert hall pieces, and so on. Just to give you an example, uh, some of the most British things songs that you can think of are All Things Bright and Beautiful, Once in Royal David City, I Vow to Thee, My Country, The Lost Chord, Onward Christian Soldiers, and the list goes on, and all of Gilbert and Sullivan. And they all either have an Irish poet, Irish lyricist, or an Irish composer. And that's what we consider the body of English music. Of course, there are other people in there, Elgar, who was sort of English, and Holst, who was trained, and all those people who were trained by Charles Villiers Stanford. In fact, when Holst, and he was a great friend of Conrad Noel, he used to hang around with William Morris, so Yeats was kind of in and out of all that. Conrad Noel was a socialist vicar who eventually got moved to Thaxted. So when Holst wrote his Great Planet Suite, and he had this piece in the middle for Jupiter, and that's the tune that's now called Thaxted, to which the Irish poet Cecil Spring Rice's song "I Vow to Thee, My Country" was set. So that's why he called it Thaxted. But whenever he wrote it, critics all said, "Oh, this is obviously an old Irish air." And Holst said, "Well, it's not." But he had learned about Irish tonality from Charles Villiers Stanford, and so he was touching something very deep that touched the English cultural soul, if you like. And of course, there was this whole debate in the 19th century that Ireland and the Western Isles of Scotland and Cornwall were this somehow untouched Celtic culture, while everything in Britain had got Dickensian and grinding poverty and industry and tied up with formality and all that. And there was this other wafty, drifty place where everything was beautiful and unspoiled. And in a sense, that's the desire for Bedford Park, to be a green and pleasant land. I mean, we sing, or everybody sings Hubert Parry's song to Blake's words about England being a green and pleasant land. But people in the 19th century were just dying to get that green and pleasant land back. It was revolutionary in the sense of throwing back. And the two ways they could get it were by building a community like Bedford Park, which aimed to be the ideal community built for communal happiness, like the English village was reputedly or supposed to be, or they could get it back by music coming from the Western Isles of Scotland or the Highlands or the west of Ireland, somewhere unspoiled, somewhere that wasn't commercialized. So it's quite amazing to me that the English Folk Song Society is founded by an Irishman living in this picket fenced English suburb. And again, that those guys are writing. I mean, here's one of the strangest examples. If you've ever watched the Banshees of Inisherin, there's a point at which Brendan Gleeson and the whole film, Oscar nominated film, there's a tension between the Irishman who wants to be the classical violinist and high culture, and the Irishman who just wants to have a couple of pints and be friends. So it's a really, really fascinating psychological film, if you like, or film about the study of Irish culture. But eventually, Brendan Gleeson is in a very sorry state, and he's singing to his dog, and he sings a song called Achado, which is about a rebel in the '98 rebellion who ended up with his head on a spike, and it's his lover singing the song to the dead rebel. The song was written by John Todhunter, who lived just around the corner here in Bedford Park. So, and who also wrote this comic opera with Charles Wood, and who also founded the English Folk Song Society. So that's the kind of England that we're looking at, and Bedford Park is this microcosm of all the desire in England to be other, to be somehow different, to change things, to change the way
Well,
society works.
it is quite remarkable that they. Oh, I've gone a bit hazy if you're watching us in vision now. I'm not quite sure what's happened. It is quite remarkable to think that the guy that started this kind of did it as a not-for-profit exercise, building Bedford Park. I mean,
Yeah.
I know
Well,
we've got Bourneville in Birmingham, which was built by the Cadburys
yes,
for their workers. So there
that's
was a
right.
profit for that.
Well, indeed, and the Bedford Park Society has just taken a number of members on a tour of Bourneville and Port Sunlight and Saltaire, and so they all had their own motivation, if you like, for building these kind of ideal community-based places. Um, the logic here was quite interesting. Yes, Jonathan Carr, his sister was a painter, his brother ran the gallery and was a dramatist and so on. And he actually wrote a play along with Arthur Sullivan and an actor who used to live in Bedford Park. So that all came together later. So Jonathan Carr married somebody called Agnes Fulton, and her father was an engineer. And as an engineer, he was interested in building new houses that didn't have basements, so they wouldn't have that problem that all of London has of these poky, damp, below stairs places. And so he had this idea of the English villa, and he wanted everybody to live above ground level. He also wanted them to live without having to have live-in servants, so they would all go to the servery every day for their lunch. I mean, it was an amazingly communal and communistic thing he had in mind. But he discovered, uh, as an engineer, that the train was going to be stopping, the new railway line was going to be stopping at Turnham Green. And he saw there was an orchard at Turnham Green, and one of the streets is still called the Orchard, the street that John Todhunter lived in. So he bought up a lot of land and started building these villagey houses. The style at the time was Queen Anne retro, because, and it's a kind of a long story there, but because a lot of well-to-do English people in the armed forces had gone to the Netherlands in the 30 Years' War, I think it might have been in Queen Anne's time. My history of that period is not so terribly good. My literary history is okay, but and they came back with this idea of the Dutch village. So our English village is really a village with lots of Dutch gables, and he built it in this aesthetic style because William Morris was insisting that we should be able to live aesthetically. We shouldn't just live in little boxes. I know that's Pete Seeger and it's much later, but people still do live in little boxes. And William Morris was the first person to say, well, don't have anything in your house that isn't useful or beautiful, but also that we should live with beauty around us. And that's the idea in Bedford Park. So they got, rather than architects, they got designers like E.W. Godwin to design the houses.
It
So
is
they
a
were
lovely, it's a lovely part of the world, isn't it? I mean,
yeah,
I put stuff on. In fact, if you're watching us, there's a few posters behind. I put plays on at the Tabard Theatre, which is
uh,
actually as a
yeah.
theatre above a pub. So it sounds fascinating. I mean, what a brilliant area, what a brilliant history. So just run us through the event again, and how can we get hold of tickets? And if
Okay.
you're listening to this or watching this after the event, how can we find out more about you and the Bedford Park project?
Okay, well, the website is the WB Yeats Bedford Park, www.wbyatesbedfordpark.com. So if you go there, you'll see under events this event called I Dreamt I Dwelt, uh, Irish composer using James Joyce's or Balf's title, which James Joyce covered. I Dreamt I Dwelt, Irish composers W.B. Yeats and Bedford Park's heyday, which I'm taking as the first 25 years of Bedford Park. Irish heritage, and I'll talk a little bit more about Irish heritage in a second. Irish heritage and uh, WB Yeats Bedford Park project celebrate Bedford Park's 150th anniversary. And it's just to say that Irish heritage provide bursaries for Irish composers, musicians, and singers to come and study in London, exactly as Charles Villiers Stanford and Charles Wood did 100 years ago. So they're very much part of this live tradition that we talk about.
Oh, that's
Um,
fantastic. I mean, it sounds like it's going to be a brilliant event. We've run out of time, or we could go on for
yeah,
another hour. But thank you so much for coming in, Cahal. Or coming in, I would say. Thank
same
you so
here.
much for your time, Cahal. I hope the event goes really, really well. I might see you there, actually.
Good.
It's
Look forward
this
to that, Nick.
Wednesday.
Yeah.
And we'll put some details below if you're watching us on bohemianbritain.com. But thank you very much. Thank you for your company. I'm Nick Hennegan. This is Literary London on bohemianbritain.com as well, but chiefly and primarily on Resonance 104.4 FM.